The topic tonight is Synod Update. Is true listening and dialogue possible? Our guest speaker is Heidi Schlumpf. I hope I said that right, Heidi. She's the Executive Director and Vice President of National Catholic Reporter.
Well, thank you so much, Leanne, for that introduction, Sister Barbara for the prayer, and to the association for inviting me to come update you about what's been going on with synodality. And in just my conversations in the last half an hour with some of the organizers, my expectation is that you're pretty familiar with what synodality is, but I thought I would start by outlining a little bit of where we're going to go tonight. And I want to leave plenty of time for questions and conversation at the end. So I'll give you a little bit of a brief background about the Synod, and I want to tell a little bit of a story about my own conversion from pessimism to optimism about the Synod on synodality. And then I'll give you some updates about what's been going on in the past weeks or months or even in the last couple of days, and talk a little bit about what this might mean for the future of the church. So when I use the term synod or synodality to non-churchy friends or even to regular massgoers, many of them give me a blank stare back. So it is an institutional process, and so our following institution tend to know about it. And as we journey together through the process, more and more people are hearing about it. But I think most of you know some of the background that the process, this idea of being advisory specifically to the Pope, goes back to the Second Vatican Council. And previous synods, they were called synods of bishops, were primarily bishops getting together to gather. And the understanding that I have, I was not covering synods at this time, was that they were kind of done deals. The document was already written in advance. People, stood up and gave their speeches, and then they basically approved what everyone knew was going to come out of it. But under Pope Francis, the idea of synods has really changed, and it's made it certainly more interesting for us as journalists to cover. And it has meant a more consultative way of governance for the church. So it's a little messier, but a lot more people are involved. And you're probably aware of the synods that have taken place under Pope Francis. So first we had the synods, because there were two meetings on the family, and then the synod on youth and young people, and then the synod on the Amazon. So when the announcement came that the next synod was going to be on synodality itself, I have to say, and this was launched just in October of 2020 under the theme Communion, Participation, and Mission. I have to admit, when I first heard a synod on synodality, I kind of rolled my eyes. I thought, this is a process about a process. And it didn't seem, from my perspective as a journalist, where I'm trying to find stories and articles for our readers that affect them where they live in their daily life, I wasn't sure if it was going to be relevant to people. And I wasn't alone being a little pessimistic at the beginning of this process. So in part because of the timing and coinciding with the coronavirus pandemic, it seemed a little disorganized at the beginning. People weren't sure what to expect. There was pessimism from both kind of ideological sides. So people on the left, more progressive Catholics, were kind of concerned. The history of the past couple decades hasn't exactly been one where everyday Catholics' opinions have been valued too much, and there was concern, even if they were valued at some of the more local levels, that as the process moved up hierarchically, things might get watered down or changed. And there was also some pessimism on the side of people from the right. So there was concern about, is this turning the church into a democracy? Is this all about trying to change things that they didn't want to see changed? In the middle were a lot of people who I think didn't even know that this synod was happening or being discussed or being planned and launched. Again, it's an institutional process. So if you're into the institution, then it would be meaningful to you. But for so many increasingly number of people, especially young people in the West, they're not super connected to the institution, even as they have maybe some openness or admiration for Pope Francis. So where I did see enthusiasm for the Synod in the beginning came from Vatican II generation. So people who have, maybe dedicated much of their lives, or at least had a lot of hopes and prayers most of their adult lives, for a more inclusive church. And so I think the idea that there would be this consultative process was encouraging to them, and there was this idea that maybe we could recapture some of the spirit of Vatican II and forward with a process that was going to be more moving towards church reform in some ways. So thinking back to 2018, I attended the Synod on Youth and Young People, the meeting that happened in October. And as a journalist, I was very fascinated. It was my first trip to Rome and to the Vatican, and to see the universality of the church, people from all over the world coming together to discuss this, incredibly important topic. But personally, for my own spirituality, which is not, super invested in, popes and bishops, what was more meaningful for me personally at the time was the canonization of Saint Oscar Romero, which was happening at the same time as the Synod meeting. And reflecting back on the Synod on Youth and Young People, in the end, it didn't really seem to do much. There had been a lot of consultation on the front end with young people from all over the world. They had, contributed their input, and it had all been pulled together into the preparatory document. But it didn't seem to really affect any change in the church. It didn't seem to impact the young people I know in my own life. And it seemed a little bit like hopes were raised, and then only to be kind of dashed, or at least subdued a little bit after the Synod was over. You may remember the synods on the family raised the issue of relaxing some of the rules around communion for divorced and remarried people, and that didn't really happen. LGBTQ issues were brought up a lot in the Synod on Youth and Young People. And of course, with the Synod on the Amazon, in addition to many other issues that were looked at there, some issues around priesthood or women deacons, or lay men possibly taking on some liturgical roles were brought up, only again to not to move forward. So again, I was kind of sitting here at the beginning of the Synod on synodality, thinking, well, this is an important news story, but I wasn't too enthusiastic. And I can just tell you that I'm sort of a pessimistic person anyway. Journalists tend to be a little cynical, I guess, over time. But over time, I did have colleagues at NCR, specifically our previous correspondent, Josh McElwee, our columnist, Michael Sean Winters, who were trying to tell me, I think this is going to be something big. This has the potential to really be a new way of being church. And I have to say, they were right. And after 2 years of following the process, and we're only about halfway through because we've got 2 more years to go, I'm starting to be converted to the belief that synodality, so the Synod on synodality, but just synodality as a process and potential to really have an effect on both the universal church, the church here in the United States, and even on us as individual Catholics. I think it's a way to institutionalize or normalize some of what we associate with Pope Francis's papacy, which is his priorities of being a listening church, of being a body that is accompanying people where they're at and showing mercy. So I don't know if the word synodality is ever going to catch on, because it still sounds a little jargony to me. But I think the process and the topic is more important, and I'm much more positive about it than I was in the beginning. So that's a little bit of my story. but I can tell you a little bit about what changed my mind. And it kind of follows the phases. As you may know, the Synod on Synodality is rolling out in phases. So the first phase was the diocesan phase. They launched in the fall of 2021. And many of you, I'm sure, were involved either at your parishes, or I heard that the association as well held many listening sessions. Again, I was kind of nervous about this in the beginning. And at NCR, we had some reports about how some dioceses weren't really getting on the ball about it. My own session, attended a session at my own parish here in Chicago, and it was sparsely attended, and it did not have young people in it. It did not reflect the diversity of our parish. And to me, it sort of seemed like, well, here we are asking for the same things we've been asking for years, for decades, really. And to be fair, it came during, or shortly on the heels of the pandemic. I think to many archbishops or bishops, it was one more thing added to their plate, or even to pastors. Some of them had already had synodal type listening sessions or gatherings in either, at the parish level or in the diocese. And so this seems sort of repetitive. So, I think there's some reasons that maybe things didn't, explode so quickly at the diocesan level. But in retrospect, there was also a lot of really good things going on that partly I didn't learn about until a little bit later, and some of our reporting revealed. Some places really went all out, and there were some parishes that held multiple listening sessions and had large crowds of people come, both in person, and then they would hold virtual gatherings. I'm thinking specifically about how if you've heard about in Davenport, Iowa, I think their director of evangelization for the diocese had this idea around the 58,000 cups of coffee, this idea that true synodality happens over a cup of coffee. And if every Catholic in the diocese who had returned to Mass after COVID would have a conversation with 3 other Catholics, they would have 58,000 cups of coffee. I was also really encouraged by the meetings that were had in what was called Region 16. So in addition to happening parish and diocesan level, they broke up the United States into these 15 regions, and then added Region 16 for these other groups that met and had listening sessions. So we had some reporting about who some of those groups were, but I was happy to see they included things like Call to Action, Voice of the Faithful, Women's Ordination Conference, and even Women's Ordination Conference had some materials that were included on the Synod, the Vatican Synod's website, as well as some materials from New Ways Ministry, which ministers to LGBTQ folks. So all of that, it just started to seem there was some momentum happening, and good conversations were taking place. In the middle of all this, we have Sister Natalie Beckhart being named as the undersecretary. So we have this, she's a religious woman, but layperson, obviously, and a woman being, near the top in leadership. And I've met her several times and was very enthusiastic about that. So this was sort of when my conversion started happening, and I started thinking, this is starting to be a very, there's a lot of energy. There's some energy happening around this. So then we move in, that's the diocesan phase and the parish and diocesan phase. Then we move into phase 2, which is at the Episcopal Conference level or the national level. And it was just this past summer, as I'm sure most of you know, and I think I heard someone discussing that you were going to have these resources available for people to check out. The national body got together, the USCCB got together to put together the document for the US Bishops' Conference. And if you read the National Catholic Reporter, you know that we can be quite critical of the bishops in the conference when they're not handling things well or speaking up when we think they should be. But I have to say, from the things I heard, and I spoke to someone who was part of the pulling together of all of these reports from around the country and putting together our national document, it was quite a process. This was not what people had feared, which is that these documents would come in and get kind of filed in the circular file, and someone would just write up a preordained kind of document. There were a number of people who hunkered down for a whole weekend. Each read and was read by one person in this group. There was a lot of conversation about how to synthesize and make sure that it was accurately representing what was being read from the regional diocesan reports. So when that national document came out, surprisingly, or maybe not surprisingly, some of those, our columnist Chris Schenk calls them elephant in the sanctuary issues, were mentioned, like women's ordination, like LGBTQ relationships, like abuse crisis. So I think there was maybe some pleasant surprise when people saw that document that came out that had a real frank, honest summary that seemed to reflect what people had experienced on the local level. So then as it's moving sort of up the chain, that those Episcopal parts forwarded to Rome, and in late September, sorry, I'm just getting a note saying my internet connection is unstable. So let me know if you're having any difficulties hearing me. Okay, good. So then in late September, we have the group of folks who are meeting in Frascati, Italy, to start working on the next phase, which is going to be the continental stage. And they were putting together the preparatory document for that. But this time they're doing on even a larger level. They're taking all of these Episcopal Conference documents and trying to summarize them. So it just so happened that right around the time that was happening, I attended an event in Washington, D.C. that was sponsored by the Leadership Roundtable, which is a group that offers kind of advice for Catholic organizations. And it was one of the first times that I was starting after COVID to get out and be in a big with hundreds of other people. So at this event, we had a live address from Cardinal Grech, who was in Frascati leading this group. And he did it obviously via Zoom with us. And so I was incredibly impressed by the things he was saying. And he had been saying them, I think, all along, but to sit there and hear him live talking to us about the importance of listening, the need for change in the church, the idea of not excluding anyone. He talked about how the church needs to trust the people and trust the Holy Spirit, and that the Holy Spirit doesn't just act in bishops. The Holy Spirit is in all of us. This should seem like a no-brainer, I guess. To hear it coming straight from a Vatican official, I thought was very encouraging. Initially, this whole event that we attended, this summit, was supposed to be off the record, but I eventually got permission for his talk to be on the record, and we ran an article about it because I thought it really was, quite honestly, pretty striking and encouraging. And then shortly after they gathered, then their working document was released, and once again, the headlines are about how these hot button issues are mentioned. They did not get flushed out at the higher levels. And it wasn't just people in the West who were talking about it. So some people were concerned that, these issues might have been raised in the US preparatory document, but these are not the issues of other people around the world. So that wasn't true. So this document, which just came out, I guess that was in October, has the title "Enlarge the Space of Your Tent." So its title refers to greater inclusion. We had some reaction from people in South Africa, and the one that really struck me was that the head of the Women's Ordination Conference, they were very pleasantly surprised to see that women's ordination, or the possibility of at least conversation about it, was in this document coming from the Vatican. So we ran an essay from her where she said, question, here comes the revolution, question mark. Now, I am careful to moderate my expectations because I don't think, just like in previous synods, I don't think this is necessarily going to lead to quick changes in longstanding church practice or doctrine. But I do think that as the stages have proceeded, that instead of being what some people had been concerned about, that things would get watered down, I think we've seen the exact opposite happen. And that's been what sort of led to my more conversion of optimism and willingness to trust this process and see what it might mean for the church. So what's been the latest news of what's happening and where are we going from here? The next phase that we'll be moving into is the continental phase. And I know there's some concern about that because certain, the representatives for the continental phase are kind of picked, and they have already had the meetings I know have already started. There was head of the U.S. Bishops Conference, Archbishop Broglio, was just over in Rome for the beginning of those regional meetings for the continental phase. I know that there's going to continue to be input at the continental phase, and there's going to be these online meetings for like the U.S. and Canada region or continent, and that also bishops from Latin America and Mexico will be having sessions. I'm not exactly sure how that all is going to be working out, but they're supposed to be coming up starting in December, January. Other continents are having them throughout February, I think, and even March. The biggest news that happened was, and it was somewhat surprising, I think, to a number of people, that Pope Francis announced that in addition to culminating with the meeting in Rome in October of 2023, that the Synod on Synodality is now going to be a two-meeting or a two synod type event. So 2023 October and then October of 2024. So there's a fair amount of speculation. What does this mean? Why is he doing this? Is this him punting it down the road and thinking, what have I started and I'll leave this to someone else? I tend to believe that it's his way of saying this is not a once and done sort of thing. This is something that is moving from a one-time event to a process, and it reflects what he's been doing with synods all along, and making them not just about that one-time meeting, but having it be a long lead up that involves a lot of people, and then also the sort of decision-making part of it and spreading it out over the course of a year. We turned at NCR, we turned to Archbishop Coleridge from Australia to say, what do you think this means? Because he was the representative from Australia to the Synod on the Family, which you will remember was also a two-meeting process. And in his essay for us, he was saying the same thing. Like this is a way to show that it's moving from an event to a process. And he emphasized that the in-between time, so from after October 23 and while we're waiting for October 24, that's not like a dead time. It's not a timeout, but really more of a time of fermentation, a time to sort of sit with and wrestle with and continue to have conversations about what's been discussed so that the second meeting can be even more fruitful. So that's one piece of the big news, is that this has now been extended from being a 3-year process to being a 4-year process. The other thing that's been happening and that we've been sort of covering a little bit is some of the anti-synod sentiment that's been there all along, but we're seeing a little bit more of it, especially I think as the process continues. And like I said, some of these hot button issues continue to be raised. They're not being flushed out. I think more conservative Catholics are concerned and not particularly pleased with the synodal process. So many of them are not huge fans of Pope Francis to begin with. So we've heard all along from conservatives, the church is not a democracy, that we can't just get together and vote on things. That's not what the synod process is. That's not what the synodal process is. Pope Francis has been very clear about that, and the way it's set up, it's clear that it's not, keeping track of how many people say things and voting on things. Other critics have talked about the relatively small number of people who have participated in terms of how many people attended, diocesan synodal listening sessions, or you could send your thoughts and feelings directly to the Synod office in the Vatican. Of course, what's interesting to me about this critique is both the same people who are critiquing this didn't participate, but then they like to be able to say, well, I don't think this represents me, but they chose not to participate. So, we're seeing some of those, names in the conservative movement, being pretty vocal about their opposition to the synod. So, George Weigel, the biographer of John Paul II, he wrote a piece in First Things magazine talking about how, this golden age of traditionalist Catholicism was happening here in the United States, and that, that according to the synodal reports, you wouldn't know about it. So he kind of did an open letter to the synod office telling them about that. Cardinal Mueller, who has, been a long critic of this paper, other bloggers and more conservative groups here, especially in the West, who have complained about it. I think we also saw a little bit of that. I had some concerns after the U.S. bishops meeting that just happened in November in Baltimore. So a number of us from NCR went and attended the meeting. There wasn't a whole lot on the agenda that was decided. They had elections for new leadership, and you probably know that Archbishop Broglio, who's seen as not just conservative, but with some problematic history around issues connecting homosexuality and sex abuse, having a connection to Cardinal Sedano, who has not a good history in terms of sex abuse. He was elected as president, and a number of the elections for the committee chairs were won by the more conservative bishop candidates. There was a report on the synod during the bishop's meeting in Baltimore from Bishop Flores, and it was a beautiful report. It didn't seem to me like synod or the spirit of the synod was very much infusing the rest of the meeting. Of course, we have this important synod happening in 2023, but what the U.S. bishops are prioritizing for 2024 is their Eucharistic revival. So they've decided instead that they're going to have this event in Indianapolis that's all going to be about, kind of a theology of Eucharist that's a little backward looking, if you ask me. And so there was a lot of enthusiasm about that. Especially when you compare what some other bishops' conferences are doing around the world in terms of synodality. So, for example, SALAM, the Latin American Bishops' Conference, has really embraced this. And of course, they've been doing this all along, right, for decades. And even Latino Catholics here in the United States. So the encuentros, the meetings that Latino Catholics have had here, there were up to 5 encuentros, are examples of synodality before there was the synod on synodality. So instead of with those, it seems that the U.S. Bishops' Conference is not prioritizing this in a way that they could. Some of the critiques about the synod on synodality, I think, are fair. Some people have criticized that perhaps it's too inward focused and looking primarily at internal church issues. So if you talk about, women and leadership roles, or if you talk about LGBTQ Catholics or their relationships and how they would be recognized, if you're talking about sex abuse, those are kind of intra-church issues, and they're important, and I'm glad they're being spoken about. But some critics, even more progressive Catholics, have said, they would like to see more of a focus on, us going out and being a leaven in the world and doing the work of the gospel and spreading the good news and serving humanity. So I think there are some fair critiques of where the synod is going, or would like to see it go. But overall, I think as we move into the continental phase, and we just had the most recent report was a day or two ago about, again, a very positive report coming out of the Vatican saying that these continental meetings are happening. When we were in Washington, D.C. for the leadership conference event, somebody talked about the importance of the Holy Spirit and how the Holy Spirit was guiding not just the synod, but guiding the church. And I do think in the end, it may not look like what we all, what any individual wants it to look like. I do think I take to heart what someone told me, which is that at the beginning of the Second Vatican Council, not everyone believed, they didn't realize then how important this was going to be. I mean, obviously it was important. It was a council of the universal church, but to the extent that we're still growing and sort of leaning into what we could be implementing from the Second Vatican Council even today, I think that synodality has the potential to be, as people are saying, a new way of being church for us. And it may not be that in October 2024, we have it all wrapped up neatly with a bow, but it could be the beginning of a long process by which the Holy Spirit sort of reinvigorates a church that so desperately needs it. And so I'm pretty optimistic about that. So I'm going to stop there, and maybe we can move towards some questions if people have, or comments. I'm interested in hearing some other people's experiences, if what I've said resonates or not. And I'm happy to answer questions about other issues that are in the news, or questions about NCR as well.
Okay. Well, thank you very much. We really appreciate you bringing your expertise, your experience, and the value of your covering this story from the beginning. So thank you very much for your presentation. Now we have an opportunity for some interaction. If you have a question that you'd like to direct to Heidi, or a comment on something that she said, or an observation, we'd welcome that. I've got Jim Ruck helping me as a spotter. Ethan, maybe if you could put us back on the gallery view so that we can see if somebody is raising their hand. There also is in the bottom of your screen a thing called reactions, and there's an opportunity to raise your hand using that. So that's another way to draw our attention to you if you have a comment, a question, or an observation you'd like to make. So I'm going to start it off while Jim scours the screen here for another one. So Heidi, as a journalist, you're always trying to make complex and complicated matters intelligible to the average reader. What's your perspective on synod as too jargonish? And should the church be looking at a word that's more accessible to the person in the pew?
Yeah, so I mean, this is a problem not just with the term synodality, of course, but with a lot of church language, right? It's not accessible to people who are maybe outside the church. One of the cool things about the synod and synodality is that it made clear from the beginning that it was not to be just a process for people in the church. So it was also for ex-Catholics. It was supposed to be ecumenical or interreligious. The idea was to go to the margins, as Pope Francis often talks about, and to hear from people who we wouldn't normally hear from. And there were listening sessions with incarcerated people, with people in homeless centers, with people who are refugees. We also have to remember that we're a universal church, so not everybody speaks English. And so sometimes language may not resonate for us, but it might resonate in other contexts. I think what we do as journalists then is we're trying to, always use the term, but also explain it. I do think that if it turns out that synodality is something that is really influential in the church, it will be language that people will eventually adopt. But my initial reaction to it was that it was kind of jargony. I love the idea of a journey as much as anybody else, but that's also kind of became a very jargony spiritual term as well. But in the end, journeying together is pretty much what we're doing. So, but yeah, I hear you with the term. I haven't been able to think of a better one. Maybe someone else has.
Well, you referred to the Hispanic Latino and Cuento, which I think is more accessible a term. But so anyone else, again, please use the chat. If you have something, you can type it in the chat. Again, Jim is helping me to monitor that. So far, I haven't seen anything in the chat.
Yeah.
Jim, have you seen anything yet?
Yeah, nothing in the chat. And a lot of people have their video off, so it's hard to see a raised hand. But I did see one from John Osterley.
Heidi, thank you for sharing with us. Do you know if there are examples in the United States where parishes, local churches are becoming more synodal? The bishops obviously are not, but what's happening on the local level? Is there much you know about that?
Yeah, so I think in some ways that's the encouraging part is that some places, even my parish, for example, we've had, and I don't think we use the term synod, I'm trying to think what we called them, but we've had these sort of state of the parish, everybody come together and share your thoughts and feelings. We've had those kinds of meetings regularly. And so when they said, oh, okay, now we're going to do that again for the synod, that might be partly why we didn't get such a great response, is because we've been doing it all along. And I know that some dioceses have been doing that as well. So specifically, I know about San Diego, where they've had a series of, and they use the term synods, I think. They've had a series of synods there under now Cardinal McElroy. And so again, when the synod came along, he was like, oh, we just did year, right, with all these listening sessions around the topic of women or young people. So it is happening on the ground. It certainly is happening in other countries as well. The Ceylon meetings are an example of Episcopal synodality that I think is a good model. So perhaps this synod on synodality is a way to, like I said, sort of normalize it and make it part of something that everybody does, not just if you're lucky enough to live in the San Diego diocese, for example.
Thank you. Thank you.
Sure.
Jim, anyone else you see, or I don't see anything in the chat?
Yeah, there's nothing in the chat. I have one.
Go ahead, Jim.
A lot of the criticism from more conservative Catholics seems, at least to me, to be based on, the church has it right, and if only everybody would just knuckle down and accept the dogma and the style, all would be swell. And the reluctance to talk seems to be around what's to talk about, other than to concede. Can you talk a little bit about that and probably how insane it is, my evaluation, but also the walking together? I mean, have you seen efforts of conservative and liberal folks actually trying to look for the common ground and make some space together?
Yeah, obviously the polarization that's happening in our whole world, in our church, here in the U.S., has the synod worked on that at all and brought us together? Not in a substantial way that I've seen yet, but it certainly, is a better, I think over time, it might be able to have some effect on that. And it certainly is a better approach than just, going into our separate camps and not having anything to do with one another. So, I think one of my concerns is that conservative Catholics who are, not fans of Pope Francis, they don't think the synod process is valid or relevant. then don't participate and then just criticize when they could be having an impact by bringing their, issues to the table. So, instead of writing an open letter in First Things, George Weigel, and maybe he did, could go to his parish synodal gathering and share his, feelings about thinking that the church has everything right and has nothing to learn. I think you're right that attitude that we already have all the answers and everyone else just needs to sort of come to accept that is not part of what synodality is, because synodality is about listening and hearing people's experiences. Now, it doesn't mean that just because the church has heard our experiences, the church is then going to change to accommodate our experiences. So this is the part that is a little concerning to me, that people's hopes will get kind of raised again, and then change might not happen in the way they think it's going to happen. My colleague likes to point out to me that there was a time not that long ago when just talking about women's ordination was not allowed, and that people could lose their jobs just for bringing up the topic. Now we have the Women's Ordination Conference materials on the Synod webpage. We have women's ordination raised in the working document. Now, that doesn't mean in October 24, Pope Francis is going to say, thank you very much, we're now going to ordain women. But it is movement. It's kind of slow movement for some people, but it is movement. I see a lot of hands raised, so maybe I should stop.
Yeah, so the first was Joan Hutton. Joan, do you have a comment or a question?
Thank you, Heidi. I really love the National Catholic Reporter. It's kept me in the church all these years because I don't understand why, if we're speaking about inclusion of people in the church, why the bishops are talking about individual matters of people are not of concern, because that's what the church always told us back in the day, that really it's only what the church tells you that is of concern, not your own conscience. And I'm wondering if they have come a little farther with people who have prayed and listened to the church's attitudes about any subject, LGBT or divorced people receiving communion, or people actually using their own conscience after they know what the church teaches. And yet we were taught one thing that they never bring up is your primary thing is to follow your conscience in every issue that you're wondering about what to do. Now, I wonder if they've been coming more toward that now. That would be a good thing with inclusion for people to make their own decisions according to their conscience, which is king. And also the fact that a few years ago, a very good Catholic told me, we are the church. I thought, what? Oh, we're not. I never really, over all these years, thought that the church ever thought that we, the laity, are the church. It's not us, it's them. And I'm wondering, and this is another thing that I would just want to ask you. I have tried to get to our bishop and ask him a question, and I could never get through for some reason. And maybe they don't want to hear from me, but the main problem we have in the United States right now is not all these issues about making your own decisions about your conscience and still loving God and love your neighbor. But that's the main thing we have to get back to. Why aren't the bishops and even the other religions on TV and in the media railing against the hate groups in America? This is ruining not only the Catholic religion, but our souls. Do you understand that I don't believe these issues, as important as they are, you must follow your conscience. But on the other hand, the main problems I don't hear from the Catholic Church is railing against the hate groups.
Jane, could you let Heidi comment?
Sure.
Sure. Yeah. So I definitely agree with you. I was taught about the primacy of an informed conscience, of course. And I think that seeing with the leadership in the US church, at least, is, we're still living decades of bishops who were appointed under John Paul II, under Pope Benedict, who were chosen more for their, willingness to check the boxes. I agree about women's ordination, about these hot button issues, and not for their, pastoral sensitivity or ability to recognize that the laity are the church. Now, Pope, this March, it will be 10 years of Pope Francis, and over time, he has appointed a number of bishops who are, Francis friendly, who, they're not, super lefty liberal people necessarily, but they're more pastoral, less rigid about certain doctrine things. But, it's going to take a long time because the bishop serves till, 75 and sometimes past that age. And so we have, what we have is a conference at the leadership level, and the more conservative bishops still outnumber the more progressive bishops appointed under Francis. And to be honest, when Francis, or the congregation for, or the castery now for bishops, it's about who they're going to appoint for a bishop, they have to choose from the current priesthood. So they're not going to pick me or anything. So you have a certain small pool to choose from when you're looking for leadership in the church. And the movement toward more conservative as well makes, I think, it tough to find bishops who are going to provide the leadership we want. That said, there's a lot of hope and enthusiasm around Pope Francis. Again, he's not like super duper liberal. I think he has a lot to learn about women, for example. But he has an openness that is very different than the two predecessor popes. And that's attractive, I think, to people. What the problem that's happening, and I'm not just thinking about people who are in the church, but I'm thinking about Protestants and other people who observe the church and sort of lump the Catholic Church in with, for example, right-wing evangelical Protestants who tend to have a lot in common with more conservative Catholics, especially as they sort of embrace their politics maybe before their religion. Right. Is that the positiveness about Pope Francis is getting a little bit lost in the US context, where Catholic is starting to be synonymous with like Trump supporter. So I'm concerned about that as well. And at NCR, we just believe there are still a lot of Catholics who don't feel represented by the current Episcopal leadership. And so we're trying to tell the stories of those Catholics while providing the news about the other stuff that they need to know about. So,
thank you.
Keep reading.
Got some more hands up. I'm going to invite Sister Barbara Finch to unmute, and then she has her hand up. Sister.
Yes, Heidi. In the censuses, I see a lot where people commented that we need to be more welcoming. And I just wonder if there's anything surfacing with the groups that are perusing the reports of how that might come about. I have a feeling that the hierarchy still hasn't got, how to be welcoming. It seems like they're alienating more people and more people are leaving. So it seems to me that somehow the laity, we are the people that need to be more welcoming. But what's your thoughts around that?
Yeah, I mean, that's a really good point. I haven't seen a lot that's real concrete around that. But it's a start to even say it, I guess, which is maybe sort of sad that we would settle for that. Again, I feel like that in Iowa, that was about welcoming. So they looked at the number of people who had come back after COVID to Mass. And, most of the reports I'm seeing is that I think it's like in the 60-70% level. Now, certain places have a lot more people coming back. I think large growing suburban parishes in certain parts of the country have gotten closer to, the majority of people coming back after COVID, but a number of places, they lost a lot of people who realized, like, I didn't go on Sundays for a year and a half, and I didn't miss it. Like, it was not, feeding them in such a way. So the idea is how to talk to those people and provide something that is life-giving to them, that speaks to them in their when life is good or when life is not so good. I thought that cups of coffee idea was a good one to try to get Catholics to talk to each other. But I think you're right, Sister Barbara, that there's not a lot of concrete ideas around the welcoming yet.
There was a comment to check the chat, and the first one in the chat was James, who also has his hand up. Jim McCarville.
Thank you. Yeah, I'm concerned you might be letting the U.S. bishops off a little too easy. There were two articles recently. Well, I think one in your magazine, something about the bishops are it's no longer the bishop's church. I think that was the title, and the other one was, are the bishops really still relevant after they went ahead and they elected a person who's got a history of being antagonistic to Ceylon and to Archbishop Bergoglio when he was in Argentina, particularly. It just seems like they're bruising for a fight. It's not that they're giving it a low priority, but that we have a real problem on our hands if this is the course that they're going to take. And I think Bishop Stowe has pretty much said the same thing. Do you have any comments on how bad this thing can get?
Well, Jim, no one's ever accused me of letting the bishops off too easily, so thank you for that. I guess I would say, I think you're right. I'm not super optimistic that our Episcopal leadership, at least most of them, you mentioned, for example, Bishop John Stowe of Lexington. I think he does get it. I think Bob McElroy from San Diego. There's, even here in Chicago, Cardinal Supich. I think there are a number of people who get it, but as a body, so the majority of them, and in the official business that they do, especially the parts that are public, either the statements or the meeting, it's not encouraging. So take, for example, in Baltimore in November was the issue of the faithful citizenship document. I mean, what could be more important at a time when democracy in our country is so under attack and possibly even in danger? And our bishops are still using a document from, before Pope Francis was even made Pope. And they just do some small tinkering with it every 4 years. And they once again voted to say, oh, we don't have time to start over and do something by 2024. So we'll just stick with the document we have. A document that, is, as your previous question person said, tells you what to think rather than encourages people to vote their conscience. It tells you which issue is preeminent for that. They've decided.
Do you see any opportunity for lay participation at this stage? I know that the Continental document asked for ecclesial participation, and it appears our bishops are going to ignore that. Is there any way we can get our voice heard that we're upset with this?
It's my understanding that there's still going to be ways to have input in the continental phase. So I'm not 100% sure about this. I'm not the person who's doing all the reporting. Obviously, Chris White in Rome and Brian Fraga has been doing most of our reporting here in the U.S. on the synod. But it's my understanding that there is possibility for some input still at this point. But whether we can sit back and expect our bishops' conference to do much that's inspiring on this, I'm not. Although again, just to backtrack, the national document was quite good. So there's that, and I think that's probably more attributable to the many of them are lay staff at the USCCB who worked on it.
Thank you.
So I don't know if I'm going to say your name right, so I apologize. Is it Kimo Young has your hand up?
Yeah, Kimo Jung. Thank you very much for this interesting conversation. Some of us come from parishes which got behind this process and some of us don't. I know you're a reporter, not an activist, so I'll ask my question this way. In your reporting, have you heard of any examples of the laity who are channeling the Holy Spirit to help push this along within their own parishes or dioceses, things that we might be able to emulate in our homes? I guess I'm asking for suggestions on how we can be nudges in this process to make sure that it doesn't get forgotten.
Mm-hmm. Well, I certainly, and again, I wasn't doing the on the ground reporting, editing these stories. I certainly saw reports of parishes where it was a very robust consultation. Now, I suspect that that was in part because the lay members of the parish were very gung-ho about it. They're the ones that had to show up at these many listening sessions and have the enthusiasm. But it is, as you know, probably very difficult to try to get something going in a parish if you don't have the support of the pastor, of the leadership there. I think what I saw instead was not people saying, oh, I don't have a good response in my, people are not enthusiastic in my parish, so I'm going to try and create something there. But what I saw people do was sort of go around their parish, try to have their input in the process in other ways. A number of these groups that, were holding these listening sessions to try to get people who either weren't in parishes that were doing a lot, or maybe weren't even attached to parishes anymore. So Call to Action had listening sessions, Voice of the Faithful. Universities had listening sessions, collated reports and that were sent directly to the Synod office at the Vatican. Individuals could even fill out their own feedback and send it directly to the Synod office in Rome. So that's what I saw more than people really being able to have an effect in their parishes. But there may be examples that I don't know about.
Joseph, I'm not sure, Guyon, I don't want to mispronounce your name.
Joseph Guyon. Guyon. Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you. I agree with everything that has been said. What I'm concerned about are the nuns, N-O-N-E-S. In my own family, my nieces and nephews, and now their children, the church means nothing to them, absolutely nothing. Many of them went to Catholic school, Catholic colleges, but the great nieces and nephews are not being baptized. One of my sisters died of COVID, and her children didn't, the church just was not involved in anything. And how do we get these people involved? It's not that they're angry. They're just, the church means nothing. Absolutely nothing to them.
Yeah, well, I'm so sorry, sister.
Yeah.
First of all, but yeah, I get this question everywhere I go, and it's also, I'm living it in life with my own relatives as well. So, I don't think there is a simple answer to whether the church, here in the US specifically, is going to be relevant for future generations. We certainly are not looking good in terms of the number of people who are disconnecting institutionally from organized religion across the board, not just Catholicism. And it is concerning to, people for whom this has been very important. They want it passed on to their family and to those of us who are part of the institution for our livelihood and our passion, whatever our life's passion is. I do have to say, though, that my study of history and listening to other people who know the history of the church better than I remind me that there have been periods like this before. I think it's easy to think that we're living at a time when institutional church is struggling, and imagine that the previous 2,000 years were all hunky-dory, and it wasn't always. And in fact, even just 50 years ago, there might have been more institutional participation, but there was some unevenness in terms of how authentic some of that was, or really personal. So, I am concerned, very concerned. I don't think reality in and of itself, or even Pope Francis, however long he may live or be Pope, is the perfect solution to that, and then everyone's going to come running back. But it's part of my faith that I trust Jesus didn't leave us the church only for it to die in the 21st century. And I trust that the Holy Spirit is stirring some things up right now, and that there, at least things seem a little more moving in the right direction than they were 10 years ago. So I sometimes say I am concerned about our church, I'm concerned about our country, and I'm more optimistic about our church actually than I am about our country right now. So that may be not saying, but I'm trying to hold on to that hope. But I share
Thank you.
your concern.
Thank you.
Leanne, you have your hand up.
My question relates to there are the potential of 22 bishops, either through those being vacant or those who will retiring, and Pope Francis will have the opportunity to replace them in this coming year. Does that give you hope that there may be on the way a more progressive attitude, at least of some of the bishops and leadership in America?
Yes and no. Yes, in the sense that is true. So if bishops are named by Pope Francis, I think they're more likely than those who were named under the previous two popes to not be so rigidly conservative. That said, what I hear is that part of the reason so many of those are open is because they can't even find people to say yes to some of these positions. It's a tough, I wouldn't want to be a bishop. It's a tough job. There are a lot of challenges, not a lot of resources. We just talked about the declining membership and the shrinking. Most bishops are going through some sort of process of merging parishes and closing parishes, although there certainly is growth in some parts of the country. I think there's something to be optimistic about there, and the voting at the bishops' conference meeting, now all the voting is secret, so you don't know who votes which way. And increasingly at the bishops' meeting, they're having more of their conversations behind closed doors, which journalists don't like. But I did hear from all the bishops that I talked to, even progressive ones, that they really appreciated that they haven't, they often don't know one another, they don't have relationships with one another, and the ability to have conversations in small groups was more helpful to them than the sort of grandstanding of standing up in front of the media and public and making speeches. But some of the votes were closer. So for example, instead of being 200 to 60, they were 130 to 90 or something. So you can see that there's movement in that direction. Yes.
So Don Katchen, did I say that right, Don?
Close enough. Thanks, Don McCacken. Thank you. I'd like to comment in the form of a question to both what Leanne was just talking about, and then previous to that, what Joseph was talking about. This appointment of bishops is complicated, and we don't always get what we thought we were going to get. I mean, look at Columbus, Ohio, huh? A guy who wants to see more Opus Dei influence at the university and so forth, and inviting the Passionists to either step aside or leave completely. how did that happen? A recently appointed bishop. So yeah, I mean, I would hope that we get some more Francis bishops, but it's not a slam dunk. And I guess that's not really a question, is it? Sorry, but to Joseph's point about who was involved in these listening sessions, there was supposed to be I think a real attempt to bring people in who don't normally have a voice, to look to grab some young people, bring those kids that don't come to church, get them in and listen to what they have to say. And, I'm just curious, in your experience, Heidi, and also maybe the group in general, did that happen on the parish level? Were the people who aren't normally listened to brought into these listening sessions?
I know there were some, and I don't know if it happened really at the parish level, but there were some attempts to try to hear from, groups that are considered marginalized that don't usually have a voice. But it is my experience that the people who were most enthusiastic about the listening session are people who, again, since Vatican II, have been trying to work for, harm or change in the church, or trying to implement sort of the spirit of Vatican II for 60 years. So I don't know if that's exactly how it's going to work, that on the front end, a lot of people who weren't normally heard from were heard from. But I think what has more potential to happen is that the people who did speak up on the front end, and the fact that it hasn't been watered down on the way up, means that then there's going to be discussion. So we can write a headline like women's ordination, LGBT issues in the document, in the national document. And that then can continue to grow and blossom, where that now becomes, again, maybe not things that change immediately, but at least they're being discussed now, and will at least provide some counterbalance to this image of the church in the United States as being aligned with like right-wing politics and stuff. So I think of it more as a long-term process than happening at the front end. And maybe young people will then be willing to revisit, especially if, I don't think it's so much like, oh, I'm going to now think about joining the church. I think there will be the movement of the Spirit in their being or in their life in such a way that maybe the church or God will somehow become important to them again. I see it in my own family, people for whom institutional religion is not important, but yeah, and when life happens, you have meaning in it, and so I'm hopeful that God will work in that way. We just need to get out of the way so that work can happen.
Excuse me.
Yeah, we were kind of between bishops when this was going on, and I will say the diocesan offices, especially the Office of Young Adults, made an effort to reach out to the NONES, and they went through the Catholic Sisters to find them.
This is in Pittsburgh?
Pardon? No, Cleveland.
Oh, Cleveland. Okay.
Thanks for sharing that, Sheila.
They literally could not find them without us, because all the ones they were connected to in the parishes were certainly not NONES. And that's all they had access to. So that group, I admired them for doing that. And some of the Diocesan Social Action Office made an effort. And
thank you.
Future Church, of course.
Mm-hmm.
Barbara, you have your hand up again?
Muted there. Two quick things. One is, how pervasive have you heard among the bishops? In my personal experience, in my conversations with our bishops, is they're saying, well, sister, it would be better if I had personal conversations with pastors, because the priests don't listen to us. So I'm just wondering if you're hearing a lot of that across the country. And secondly, the fact of you know, we have Catholic social teaching, which at the core is social justice, but it's watered away. There's just so much lack of encouragement of people participating in justice. So what are you hearing on that front as well?
Just for clarification, you're saying the bishops say their priests don't listen to them, the bishops?
Exactly. For instance, some of our priests refuse to participate in this process. Well, are you going to say something to them? Well, no, but you might have more effect if you talk to them personally. We have some people that want to have Laudato Si programs in their parish. The pastor says, no, not on our property. And you tell the bishop about that, and they'll say, well, you know, you need to talk to them yourself because they don't listen to us.
Yeah. Well, I mean, the bishop sets the tone for his diocese, but probably there are some limitations to what he can do. But also, you know, either runs a seminary where they are trained and formed, or, you know, makes a decision about where candidates are sent. I think there is some generational, you know, conflict sometimes between some in leadership and some of these younger priests. And you know, this has been an issue that people, that's been happening for years now, where the generation of folks who are choosing or responding to the call to priesthood in the last decade or so are not always people that have much of a Vatican II vision of church. And then they get in these positions and especially they're named as pastors very early on in their careers because of the shrinking number of priests. So yeah, it is possible that bishops struggle with that. But I'm not sure that a layperson speaking to the priest is going to have much effect to those folks either. And I'm sorry, what was the second question about again?
It was about justice. You know, many dioceses would have a full department of social justice. That's whittled away. It's non-existent, you know, basically. Yeah. Now we have a reformation here in Pittsburgh that just started today. It's the ecclesial office. It's going to be social concerns, but the head of the new office is telling me it's not going to promote ministry. It is to network people. If you have a question of how to respond to something, they'll help network you to what's helping in the broader community, which is much different than years ago when we were actively promoting justice ministry.
Yeah, I mean, I think people care about justice. I mean, certainly a lot of our politics in the United States is around issues that demand a justice response. But do they see that as connected to the church? That is a big question. And as I said, that is one of the critiques that might be fair about the synodal process, is that some of the documents seem to emphasize more internal issues than the importance of going out into the world and bringing justice to the world.
We've got, I see two hands up here, so we'll take these last two and then we'll move on. So Sue, you want to unmute yourself and ask your question, then we'll go to Joan, and then that'll end our open forum.
Thank you. I just wanted to respond to this idea about have the Pope having difficulty appointing new bishops because the pool is relatively small. And the point you made about the priests now entering the priesthood tend to be those that are being drawn, it seems, or responding to a vocation are those that are the more conservative. And the problem is that perhaps the priests that are being admitted to the seminaries, when they're screening them, maybe that's who they are accepting. And also in our diocese, which I personally think is probably one of the most conservative in the country, Northern Virginia, and the seminary, I just blame the seminary for the fact that it's not teaching the seminarians about Vatican II. And I had a conversation with one of our assistant priests at our parish, who I like, and he's nice, but he has those conservative elements. And I said, well, how many courses on the documents of Vatican II did you have in the seminary? And he said, well, they kind of integrate it into these other classes, and it's like it's not being emphasized. It's just not being emphasized. And I think that if we want to have good bishops, we have to, these young priests that are coming out have to have some awareness of Vatican II and the fact that, the Vatican Council said that the church is us, the people of God, and all the other documents. In our diocese, we are blessed with a Peace and Justice Commission, and it turns out that my pastor is the head of that commission. I'm in the parish that I am because of the priests that we have had, and it is a magnet for all of the, more progressive Catholics, and it's a big parish, and we do a lot with Laudato Si. We have solar panels on the roof, and it's a great parish, but he's getting older. He would be a perfect bishop, and I would, write to the Pope if I thought that if taking him away would then leave us without a good pastor, because there's only about a handful that would really fit in. So I guess I don't have a question there, except can anything be done about the seminaries and trying to get them to be more in line with Pope Francis' views and philosophy? Thanks.
Yeah, I agree with you that is a problem in this case. And part of the problem too is the the requirement of celibacy, I think, does sort of narrow the pool too of who feels called to ordination. I know plenty of women, not myself personally, who feel called to ordination, who are not recognized. At some point, our church is going to have to get on board with this. I'm a little more hopeful with some religious order priests. So, certainly among the Jesuits, we have some good guys in there. I work closely with Father Dan Haran, who's a Franciscan. He writes for us. He does a podcast with me. I think the emphasis on, maybe community life and the charisms, much like religious orders of women, tends to attract, healthier or a better caliber of person. But yeah, I share your concern about the seminaries.
Joan, we have about 30 seconds, so I know you've been very patient with your hand up there. So what would you're the last shot before we turn it back to Heidi. Joan? You're muted, Joan.
You have to unmute.
I'm Cheryl Ash. I'm here with my friends Joan and John Hawk.
Okay.
They graciously invited me over so I could see this. I guess it's a question, but it's also an observation. Here in the US, we have two very important things going on at the same time. We had the synod process, but in my diocese, South Bend, Fort Wayne, South Bend, there are also the big push with the Eucharistic endeavor, revival. I know I'm being cynical, but it seems to me it's very hard to have two very important things running at the same time. And I was interested in your thoughts on that.
I'm going to start calling it the Eucharistic endeavor. I like that.
Wrong word, sorry. And I'm the person
revival.
They're supposed to be doing it.
And it's also a 3-year process, right? Where they're supposed to be reaching out to the priests, and then they're going to get around to the lay people. At the bishop's meeting, they were talking about how it was going to be so packed, and they're really expecting so many people, and how they were going to, everyone couldn't be expected to stay in Indianapolis. And I'm not sure, maybe they will find enthusiastic people who want to go to a Eucharistic revival. I think that will continue to be a symbol of how they are putting their emphasis on that instead of synodality, and that will be a concrete way to look at it. I don't want to. I love the Eucharist as much as anybody else. I'm not down on the Eucharist, but this revival and the theology that kind of seems to go along with it, I think is in contrast to what's going on in the broader church with synodality.
And I'd like to end with one. I like to end with one thought is I find it interesting, at least to me, that this whole, I'm in charge of the Eucharistic thing for my church. You know, we getting people when we had in 90-degree weather or march for 4 miles or whatever. But I noticed that this process has not asked people in the pews really what they think about the Eucharist. Okay, it's one of the synod questions had a little bit about it, but I just find that interesting. The synod processes wanted us from the bottom up, if it worked correctly, and this Eucharistic, and I forget the name again, revivalism?
Revival, right.
Yeah.
I better learn it because I'm the one in charge of my parish for getting it. So I better learn the terminology. It's from the top down.
Okay,
Yes.
so we're getting near the end here. Hi, any last thoughts? We've had a conversation here over the last 45 minutes. If you were anything that struck you or that you would like to just share as a closing remark.
Yeah, just that, you know, what I think what I'm hearing and seeing in the comments, I was trying to read a little bit in between, is, you know, I share your concerns and I share your sadness when it doesn't seem like our leadership seems on board with not only what's going on in the pews, but what's coming from the very top. So I'm very encouraged. Like I told you, when I heard Cardinal Grech talk, I was like, wow, this is so refreshing. So I do just want to offer the hope that you're not alone. There are a lot of people out there who are in the same place that you are in our church, not just in the US, but around the world. We hear from them all the time at NCR, and I'm glad that NCR has been able to be a source of that connection for many of you. And we hope to continue to do that. I'm going to continue to be a person of hope and trust in the Holy Spirit that I'm going to let go of the outcome and see what happens, but I am going to trust the process. And I think the process is coming from a place of the Holy Spirit's work. So hopefully we can all hold that hope together and support one another through what might be a long process. So thank you.
Well, Heidi, thank you very much. We appreciate your time, your expertise. Personally, I appreciate your style of how you engaged us. And thanks to everyone who stayed with us and was engaged through the conversation.